Hello, and welcome to the Geopolitics Explained podcast. This is the podcast that breaks down complex geopolitical events into small, digestible chunks. My name is Dylan, and this has been recorded on the 29th of March, 2024. Now, this is another topic that I've been saving for quite a while, for a few reasons. Firstly, it's one that I find incredibly interesting. Secondly, it's one that's relevant not just to the present day situation that we find ourselves in geopolitically, but also the future direction in which we're having. This topic is exploring NATO expansion versus Russian aggression. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, NATO has been expanding eastwards towards Russia's border. But we've also seen the Russians show aggression against Georgia, Chechnya, Crimea, and now, of course, we have the war in Ukraine. This is a very interesting topic in my opinion, and it's one that I'm very excited to dive into. So let's dive into it. Now, in discussing NATO, many would probably think that I'd start by mentioning World War II, since NATO was formed in 1949 in the aftermath of World War II. But I'm actually going to start a little bit earlier, at the end of World War I. Now, the Treaty of Versailles imposed harsh reparations on Germany. It was clear that the Germans wouldn't be able to afford these reparations and that this would damage their economy and also the economy of Europe. This contributed to the Weimar inflation in Germany, which is a very interesting topic I'd recommend people look into themselves. I'm not going to deep dive into it today. And then we also saw the Great Depression at the end of the 1920s and into the 1930s. This led to a rise in populism in Germany, and this saw the rise of the Nazi Party, which, as we all know, contributed to World War II. Now, the Europeans had made some attempts in the past to try to create a military alliance similar to what we have with NATO today. This was called the League of Nations, and it wasn't as successful. One key factor that made it less successful was that the League of Nations didn't include the USA. Now, these reasons, in my opinion, didn't make World War II an inevitability, but they certainly might have contributed. So, after World War II, specifically in 1949, we saw the formation of NATO. Now, NATO is a military alliance. This means that if one nation in the organisation is attacked, the others are often obligated to come to the defence. This doesn't necessarily mean defence with troops in that country, which we'll come on to later since that is one of the articles of NATO. But this could mean military aid, financial aid. Now, when NATO was first formed, there were 12 members initially who founded the organisation. These were as follows: Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, the United Kingdom, and the United States. In 1952, we saw Greece and Turkey join. In 1955, West Germany, and in 1982, Spain joined. Now, as we'll get onto later, the dissolution of the Soviet Union was also a big part of the story of NATO expansion. This saw the Czech Republic, Hungary and Poland joined in 1999. In 2004, it saw Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia join. Albania and Croatia joined in 2009. Montenegro in 2017. North Macedonia in 2020. Finland last year. And Sweden joined just earlier this month. Now, there are some minimum requirements for any country who wishes to join NATO. On the website for the US Department of State, it mentions that there are at least 5 requirements at a minimum that these nations must adhere to. Firstly, these nations must be a democracy and they must be making progress towards becoming a market economy. There must be good neighbours and respect sovereignty outside of their borders. And they must be working towards compatibility with NATO forces. Finally, the military of that country must be under firm civilian control. Now, when a country gets itself into NATO, there exists 14 articles that determine how the organisation works. The most important of these that we've seen used in recent years are Articles 4 and 5. Now, Article 4 denotes that the members of NATO will get together if any of them feel threatened, whether territorially or in a general security basis. We saw it being discussed whether Poland would invoke Article 4 back in November 2022 when a missile of unknown origin entered Polish territory and unfortunately killed 2 farmers. Now, Article 5 of NATO is the article that discusses that if an armed attack occurs on one member of NATO, it is considered an attack against all of them. It's these 2 articles that are discussed most readily when it comes to the potential for NATO and Russia showing aggression towards each other. NATO is run by the Secretary General of NATO, and this ties into the reasons that the first Secretary General, Lord Hastings Lionel Ismay, believed that NATO should exist in the first place. There were 3 different characteristics to his reasonings. Firstly, he wanted to keep the Soviet Union out of Europe. He wanted to give the United States a reason to stay in Europe, which, as we know, if Donald Trump gets into the US presidency in 2024, this could potentially be threatened. And the final reason he believed NATO existed was to stop Germany from rising into a strong enough power. Now, there are other potential reasons for NATO's existence. It could be that this is the way of the United States to spread democracy around the world, to strengthen the resolve of any countries who adopt democracy, keeps them closer together, and any enemies of democracy, in the eyes of the United States, would be less likely to invoke an attack against a member of NATO if all other members were to come to the defence, which is also a debated topic that we'll discuss later. Also, in a general view, when a country maintains a hegemony over the world order, they create institutions, and it's these institutions that inform us of what we know the world to be. There are many examples of this. Take a look at the IMF, for example, the United Nations, It's these institutions that we look to when countries of various backgrounds seek to discuss their differences. The final potential reason is that the United States saw their mistake at the end of World War I in not taking a more active approach in Europe and peace in Europe. And so NATO was the way the United States decided to export their own military into Europe. It essentially gave them a reason to be there. For the sake of keeping these episodes as short as possible, we'll end this part here. Next time, in part 2, we'll explore if Russia almost joined NATO in the 1990s and what the collapse of the Soviet Union did in affecting countries joining NATO, and how Russia's decline in power eventually led it into the situation it's in today, where it's seeking to grab some of that power back. We'll explore NATO through the 2000s and the 2010s, in which Macron described NATO as experiencing a brain death. We'll explore Donald Trump and how he wants out of NATO and how this would affect NATO power. We'll also explore if Joe Biden gets into office in the 2024 US election and how funding must continue for Ukraine in the eyes of Biden and the Democrats. We'll then finally explore how much further NATO can expand, where Russia could potentially show some aggression next, and then we'll highlight the key flashpoints in this entire situation between NATO and Russia. But for today, this has been the Geopolitics Explained podcast. I thank you all very much for listening. If you feel so obliged, please do follow the podcast on the podcast platform of your choice and leave a review if you so wish. If you want more like this, I write frequently over on Substack at Geopolitics Explained. You can find the links to this and everything else in the description. I've been Dylan. Until next time, signing off.